The first thing Abigail Turner saw that night was blood dripping from the barn door onto the snow. Not fresh blood, dark blood, half frozen, trailing in uneven drops across the white ground behind a massive pair of boots. The storm had swallowed the entire valley hours ago. Wind screamed through Black Hollow hard enough to shake the windows of her little farmhouse, and snow piled so high against the porch that the front door barely opened anymore. Inside the house, the fire was dying. So was Hope. Her youngest son, Caleb, lay curled beneath 2 thin blankets near the hearth, coughing so hard his tiny body trembled with every breath. Her older boy, Samuel, sat beside him, trying to keep the fire alive with scraps of broken fence wood, because there was nothing else left to burn. 3 empty bowls sat on the table. Abigail had washed them anyway. People still washed dishes when they were starving. It made the house feel less defeated. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere behind the mountains. Then came the sound. Heavy footsteps, slow, dragging, deliberate. Abigail reached for the old shotgun beside the door before she even realized she was moving. The weapon had belonged to her husband before the mine collapse buried him under 40 feet of rock the previous winter. The shells inside were old, maybe useless, but fear still made her hold it tighter. The knock came once, not loud, just heavy enough to remind her that whoever stood outside was very, very large. Samuel looked terrified. Caleb stopped coughing long enough to whisper, "Ma." Abigail swallowed hard and opened the door only a few inches. A wall of snow burst inward with the wind, and behind it stood the biggest man she had ever seen in her life. He looked less like a man and more like something carved out of the mountain itself, tall enough that his head nearly touched the top of the doorway, broad shoulders buried beneath heavy animal fur, thick beard crusted with ice, snow frozen into his hair. A rifle strapped across his back beside a hunting axe darkened by old stains. A mule stood behind him, pulling a sled loaded with firewood and the body of a frozen elk. The stranger's face remained hidden beneath shadow, except for one terrible detail. The left side of his skin had been ripped apart long ago. Scars twisted from his temple to his jaw, like claw marks from some giant animal. One eye looked colder than the storm itself. Abigail tightened her grip on the shotgun. The man looked at the weapon, then at the frightened children behind her. Finally, he lowered his gaze toward the ground and spoke in a voice rough enough to sound like gravel breaking beneath boots. "I'll sleep in the barn." That was all. No threats, no begging, no explanation. Just a tired man asking for shelter from death weather. The wind roared between them. Abigail noticed then that one of his hands was bleeding badly. Blood ran from beneath strips of torn cloth wrapped around his palm and dripped steadily into the snow. Fresh blood. The man followed her eyes toward the wound and slowly closed his fist. "Won't bother you none," he muttered. Samuel whispered, "Ma, don't let him in." Truthfully, Abigail wanted to slam the door shut. The stranger carried death around him like cold smoke. Every instinct told her he was dangerous, but another gust of wind nearly knocked the man sideways. And for just a second, she saw exhaustion behind those dead eyes. Not drunkenness, not cruelty. Pain, deep enough to hollow a man out from the inside. Abigail looked at the mule standing behind him. The poor beast shook violently beneath layers of ice. Then she looked at the elk meat strapped to the sled. Enough meat to feed her boys for weeks. The stranger noticed her staring and immediately untied the elk from the sled. "You can have it," he said quietly, "for the barn." Abigail blinked. "You'd trade all that for hay." He shrugged once. "Need somewhere the mule won't freeze." Thunder shook the valley again. Caleb began coughing harder inside the house. The stranger's eyes shifted toward the sound instantly. Something changed in his expression, only for a second. A flicker, recognition, like he had heard that kind of cough before. Abigail opened the door wider. "The barn's around back." The giant nodded once. No smile, no gratitude, just movement. He led the mule toward the barn through waist-deep snow without another word. Hours later, Abigail still couldn't sleep. Wind hammered the roof while the boys finally drifted off beside the weak fire. But something kept bothering her. The stranger had been bleeding badly when he arrived, and despite the freezing temperature, he never once asked for help. Near midnight, she wrapped herself in a coat and stepped outside carrying a lantern. The storm had worsened. Snow whipped across the yard so hard it stung her face. When she reached the barn, she heard it, a low sound. Not talking, not crying. Pain. She pushed the barn door open slowly. The stranger sat shirtless beside the mule beneath hanging lantern light, and for the first time, Abigail truly saw him. Scars covered nearly half his body. Knife wounds, bullet wounds, burn marks. One ugly scar crossed straight through his chest. His left shoulder looked freshly torn open, the flesh swollen and dark from infection. A saw needle sat in his hand. He had been sewing the wound closed himself, without whiskey, without help. The stranger looked up sharply the moment she entered. Instinctively, his hand moved toward the revolver beside him. Abigail froze. So did he. For several long seconds, neither moved at all. Then the stranger slowly let go of the weapon. "Barn's yours," he muttered. "I'll leave come morning." Abigail stared at the wound. "You'll die before morning." "Maybe." "Hey!" He said it like the possibility meant nothing. Abigail stepped closer despite her fear. "I know how to stitch." "Number. You can barely move your arm." I said no. His voice sharpened enough to make the mule flinch. But Abigail surprised herself. She stepped closer anyway. "Then bleed to death if that's what you want," she whispered. "But not in my barn." Something strange crossed the giant's face then. Not anger. Confusion. Like he no longer understood why kindness still existed. After a long silence, he finally turned slightly and handed her the bloody needle. Abigail stitched the wound beside the lantern, while snow battered the barn walls. The stranger never made a sound. Not once, even when her hands pushed deep into torn flesh. When she finished, she quietly asked, "What happened to you?" The giant stared at the storm outside. "Bear." That was all he said. But Abigail knew instantly he wasn't talking only about the scars. Some men survived animals. Others survived worse things. Near dawn, she brought him coffee and a bowl of stew made from the last potatoes in the house. The stranger looked at the bowl for a very long time. Then he asked softly, "Why?" Abigail glanced toward the house where her boys slept. "Because starving people shouldn't have to eat alone." The giant lowered his eyes, and for the first time since arriving, he looked human. Morning came gray and bitter cold. The stranger was ready outside chopping wood before sunrise. Each swing of the axe cracked through the frozen valley like gunfire. Samuel peeked through the window nervously. What if he steals something?" Abigail watched the stranger split log after log with terrifying strength. "If he wanted to hurt us," she whispered, "he already would have." By noon, the woodpile beside the house had tripled. The barn roof had been repaired, and the frozen well pump had somehow started working again. The stranger did everything silently, like a ghost paying old debts nobody understood. When Abigail finally stepped outside with bread and coffee, she found him repairing a broken fence post with one hand. The other still bled through the bandages. "You don't gotta keep working," she said. The giant hammered the post into the ground. "Need to earn the hay. You already paid for the barn with enough meat to feed us a month." He stopped moving briefly, then continued hammering. "Still breathing," he muttered. "So debt ain't settled." Abigail studied him carefully. Men in Black Hollow talked constantly, bragged constantly, threatened constantly. But this man barely spoke at all, like words had become too heavy for him years ago. Late that afternoon, trouble arrived on horseback. Horace Bell came with snow spraying beneath polished black boots, and 2 armed men riding behind him. Everyone in the valley knew Horace Bell. Owner of the mines, owner of the grain storage, owner of most debts in town, a man who smiled with his mouth, but never with his eyes. His expensive coat looked absurd against the poverty surrounding Abigail's farm. Horace stopped his horse near the porch and glanced toward the stranger immediately. "Well now," he said softly. "What's this?" Neither Abigail nor the giant answered. Horace dismounted slowly, brushing snow from his gloves. "I gave you till Sunday." "Abigail." Her stomach tightened. "I just need more time." "You said that 2 months ago." "My boy's sick, and my patience is sick of excuses." Samuel stepped protectively in front of his mother. Horace laughed quietly. "There's spirit in him, at least." Then his eyes shifted toward the stranger again. "And who exactly are you?" The giant continued hammering the fence without even looking up. One of Horace's men smirked. "Looks like mountain trash wandered down from the hills." The other rider suddenly kicked over Abigail's water bucket into the snow. Samuel lunged forward instantly. "You leave her things alone." The rider backhanded the boy hard enough to throw him into the frozen mud. Abigail screamed. Everything after that happened fast. The giant stopped hammering. 1 second he stood near the fence. The next second he had crossed the entire yard. His massive hand seized the rider by the throat and ripped him clean off the horse. The animal shrieked in panic. Snow exploded beneath heavy boots as the stranger slammed the man against the barn wall hard enough to crack wood. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The giant never raised his voice, never snarled, never threatened. He simply held the choking man against the wall with one hand while staring directly into his eyes. And suddenly the entire yard understood something horrifying. This was not a lumbering drunk from the mountains. This was a man deeply familiar with violence. The rider clawed helplessly at the enormous hand crushing his throat. Horace slowly reached for his revolver. The giant turned his scarred face toward him. That dead cold eye stopped Horace instantly. For several long seconds, snow drifted silently between them. Then the stranger released the rider. The man collapsed into the mud, coughing violently. Horace straightened his coat carefully. "You got a name?" "Mountain Man." A long pause followed. Finally, the giant answered. "Elias Boone." The name hit Horace strangely. Not recognition exactly, but discomfort. Like hearing an old story people hoped was buried. Horace masked it quickly. "Well, Elias Boone," he said softly. "This widow owes me money, and unless a miracle happens, this land becomes mine in 3 days." He looked toward Abigail. "And when that happens, your boys go work the mine same as every other debt-born brat in this valley." Caleb began coughing violently inside the house again. Horace climbed back onto his horse. Before leaving, he glanced one last time at Elias. "You should stay out of this." Elias stared back without emotion. "I was." Then Horace and his riders appeared into the falling snow. Silence settled over the yard again. Samuel's lip bled where he'd been struck. Abigail knelt beside him with trembling hands, but her eyes kept drifting toward Elias Boone. The mountain man stood motionless in the snow, jaw tight, fists clenched, like something terrible inside him had just awakened again. That night, the storm finally loosened its grip on Black Hollow. Snow still covered the valley in thick white silence, but the wind had weakened enough for the old farmhouse to stop groaning beneath it. Inside, Caleb's fever worsened. The little boy shook beneath the blankets, sweat soaking his thin shirt, while every breath rattled painfully inside his chest. Abigail pressed a cool cloth against his forehead again and again, but the fever would not break. Samuel stood near the fire, pretending not to cry. "Ma," he whispered quietly. "Is he gonna die?" Abigail could not answer, because she did not know. The doctor in town refused to come unless she paid what she owed first. Horace Bell owned the clinic now, same as he owned nearly everything else in Black Hollow. No money meant no medicine. No medicine meant people disappeared quietly during winter. Elias sat near the door, sharpening his hunting knife beside the lantern. Slow strokes, calm strokes, but Abigail noticed the way his jaw tightened every time Caleb coughed. Finally, Elias stood. "Where's the doctor live?" Abigail looked up. "He won't come." Didn't ask that. She hesitated before giving directions toward town. Elias grabbed his coat. "You can't walk there tonight," she said quickly. "The river crossing's frozen bad." The mountain man loaded his rifle across his shoulder. "I've crossed worse." Then he disappeared into the darkness. Abigail did not sleep at all. Hours dragged by, while Caleb's breathing grew weaker. At one point, she stepped outside and stared toward the distant hills, half convinced the mountain man had simply vanished back into the wilderness where he belonged. Men like Elias Boone did not stay. Men like him drifted in and out of storms like ghosts. But just before dawn, she heard the mule returning. Elias emerged from the snow, leading the exhausted animal behind him. Blood covered one side of his coat. Fresh blood. Abigail ran toward him in panic. What happened? Elias dropped 2 heavy canvas bags onto the porch. Medicine bottles clinked inside. "The boy needs these." Abigail stared at him. "The doctor gave you all this." Elias said nothing. Only after he stepped into lantern light did she see his knuckles split open and swollen, one eye a bruised dark. Samuel whispered from the doorway. "You fought somebody." Elias ignored him completely. Instead, he knelt beside Caleb and awkwardly placed one rough hand against the boy's burning forehead. For just a second, his expression changed. Not fear. Memory. Pain so old it looked carved into bone. Then it vanished again. "Boil water," he muttered. The medicine helped. Not immediately, but enough. By the second night, Caleb's coughing weakened, and the fever finally began to break. Abigail nearly collapsed from relief. She found Elias outside behind the barn, skinning rabbits beside a small fire. "You saved my son." Elias kept working. "Not yet. You walked through a blizzard for medicine." The mountain man sliced carefully through fur and flesh. "Boy reminded me of someone." Abigail sat quietly beside the fire. After a long silence, she finally asked, "You got children?" The knife stopped moving. Snow drifted softly around them. Elias stared into the fire for so long, Abigail thought he would not answer. Then finally, "Had a little girl." The words sounded rusted, like they had not been spoken aloud in years. What happened? Elias looked toward the mountains. Winter. That was all. But this time, Abigail understood something important. He blamed himself. A few days later, Caleb managed to sit upright again. The first thing he asked for was food. Samuel laughed so hard he nearly cried. For the first time in months, the farmhouse sounded alive again. Elias remained distant through all of it. He repaired fences, cut wood, hunted before sunrise. Always moving, always working. Like staying still too long allowed old ghosts to catch him. But slowly the boys stopped fearing him. Samuel followed him constantly around the property, asking endless questions about trapping and hunting. Caleb started calling him Mr. Bear after seeing the scars across his face. The first time the little boy said it, Abigail nearly apologized. But Elias only grunted softly and handed the child a carved wooden rabbit he had secretly whittled beside the fire. That same evening, Abigail discovered something else. Elias smiled differently from other men. Not with his mouth, with his eyes, only for seconds at a time. Usually when the boys laughed. Late one afternoon, Samuel came sprinting back toward the house in terror. Riders. Abigail stepped outside instantly. 3 armed men rode through the valley, carrying Horace Bell's colors. Elias emerged from the barn at the exact same moment. One of the riders tossed a folded paper into the snow at Abigail's feet. "Official notice," the man announced. "Property seizure happens Friday." Abigail unfolded the paper with shaking hands. Her stomach dropped. Horace had accelerated the debt collection through the county court. She had 2 days left now, not 3. The riders smirked as they turned their horses away. But before leaving, one of them glanced toward Elias. "Heard Bell's asking questions about you. Mountain man." Elias said nothing. The rider grinned wider. "Folks up north remember the name Elias Boone. Lawman turned killer. Ain't that right?" Samuel looked confused. "Killer." The riders laughed and disappeared into the snow. Silence settled heavily across the yard. Abigail slowly turned toward Elias. The mountain man stood motionless beside the barn. Snow drifted across his shoulders. Finally, she asked quietly, "Were you a lawman?" Elias stared toward the distant mountains. "Long time ago." "What happened?" No answer. He walked back toward the barn instead. That night, Abigail woke suddenly to shouting. She grabbed the shotgun and rushed outside. Samuel had followed Elias into the woods after dark and stepped into a wolf trap hidden beneath snow. The steel jaws had crushed part of the boy's leg. Samuel screamed in agony while blood soaked through his pants. Abigail nearly panicked, but Elias moved with terrifying calm. He forced the trap open barehanded, despite the steel tearing into his palms. Then he ripped off his own coat, wrapped Samuel's leg tightly, and lifted the boy into his arms. "Stay awake," he ordered. Samuel cried harder. "It hurts." "I know." Elias carried him through deep snow all the way back to the farmhouse, while Abigail stumbled beside them with the lantern. Inside, the mountain man cleaned the wound himself. Samuel nearly bit through leather trying not to scream. Through it all, Elias never lost control once. Never shook, never hesitated, like he had spent years patching broken bodies in terrible places. Finally, Samuel passed out from exhaustion. Abigail looked toward Elias across the dim lantern light. "You were more than a lawman." Elias washed blood from his hands slowly. "Used to track men." "What kind of men?" "The kind worth burying." A heavy silence followed. Then Abigail noticed something strange. Elias was staring at Samuel while the boy slept. Not casually, carefully, almost painfully. like seeing something he lost long ago. "You loved your little girl very much," Abigail whispered. The mountain man froze. For several seconds, he did not breathe at all. Then he stood abruptly and walked outside into the freezing dark without another word. Abigail found him an hour later, sitting alone beside the barn. Snow gathered across his shoulders while he stared into nothing. "You should come inside," she said softly. Elias shook his head once. "Too quiet in there." "What's wrong with quiet?" He looked toward the mountains again. "That's when memories get loud." Abigail sat beside him despite the cold. After a long silence, Elias finally spoke. "Cabin caught fire 12 winters ago." His voice barely sounded human anymore. "I was trapping North Ridge. Snowstorm trapped me out 2 nights longer than planned." Abigail listened without moving. "When I got back," his jaw tightened hard enough to tremble. "There wasn't enough left to bury." Abigail closed her eyes. Elias stared into the dark valley. "Found out later somebody set the fire on purpose." Her breath caught. "Who?" The mountain man slowly flexed his scarred hands. "Never proved it. But you know." Elias looked at her then, and for the first time since arriving, real anger showed beneath the grief. Cold anger. Old anger. The man who owned the mining routes back then was named Walter Bell. Abigail's face went pale immediately. Horace Bell's father. Elias looked away again. "After my family died," he muttered. 3 men disappeared that winter. Abigail understood instantly. The rumors were true. The mountain man beside her really had killed before. But strangely, she no longer feared him, because suddenly she understood something much worse. Elias Boone had not survived the mountains. Part of him had died there long ago, and everything left afterward had simply learned how to keep walking. The next morning, Black Hollow woke beneath a sky the color of iron. Snow clouds hung low across the mountains, heavy with another storm waiting to break. Inside the farmhouse, Samuel limped carefully across the floor, while Caleb sat wrapped in blankets beside the fire, carving crooked shapes into wood under Elias's quiet supervision. For a few brief hours, the house almost felt normal. Then the riders came. 6 horses emerged through the drifting snow just after noon. Horace Bell rode at the front, wearing a long black coat and leather gloves lined with fur. Behind him came armed men carrying rifles across their saddles, and beside them rode Deputy Carter from town. The moment Abigail saw the paper in the deputy's hand, her stomach tightened. Elias stepped out from the barn slowly, wiping wood shavings from his palms. The yard fell silent. Deputy Carter avoided looking directly at him. "Court order," the deputy muttered uneasily. "Property transfer approved by county authority." Horace smiled faintly. "You and the boys have 1 hour to leave." Abigail stepped forward immediately. "You pushed the hearing early. You missed the payment," Horace replied calmly. "You bribed the judge." Horace's smile widened slightly. "Careful now." Samuel grabbed a shovel despite his injured leg. Caleb hid behind Abigail's coat. The armed riders spread wider across the yard. Elias remained still beside the barn. Too still, like a wolf watching hunters circle closer. Deputy Carter unfolded another paper with visibly shaking hands. "There's another matter." Horace looked almost pleased now. "Go ahead." The deputy swallowed hard before speaking. "Elias Boone, you are wanted for the murders of Benjamin Crow, Silas Reed, and Martin Pike 12 years ago in North Ridge territory." Samuel looked stunned. Caleb stared at Elias in confusion. Abigail slowly turned toward the mountain man, but Elias showed no surprise at all, only exhaustion. Horace stepped down from his horse carefully. Seems our mountain ghost wasn't just hiding from winter after all. No one moved. Snow drifted softly between them. Deputy Carter's voice weakened further. "You need to surrender your weapons." Elias looked toward the children first, then toward Abigail. Finally, he unbuckled the revolver from his belt and placed it slowly onto the chopping block beside him. The riders relaxed slightly. Big mistake, because even unarmed, Elias Boone still looked like the most dangerous thing in the valley. Horace walked closer. "Too close. You know," he said quietly enough for only Elias and Abigail to hear. "My father used to talk about you." Elias's eyes lifted slowly. Horace smiled coldly. "He said you screamed your little girl's name while the cabin burned." Abigail's breath caught. Samuel froze. For the first time since arriving at the farm, real murder entered Elias Boone's face. The air itself seemed to tighten. Every rider felt it instantly. Horace saw it too, but instead of backing away, he slapped Abigail across the face, hard. She crashed sideways into the snow. The boys screamed, and everything exploded. Elias moved faster than any man that size should have been able to move. 1 second, Horace stood smirking in the yard. The next second, Elias had him by the throat. The force lifted Horace completely off the ground. Riders reached for rifles instantly. Deputy Carter shouted, "Don't shoot." Too late. A gun fired. The bullet tore through Elias's shoulder, but the mountain man did not even seem to feel it. He slammed Horace against the side of the wagon so hard, the wood shattered beneath the impact. Horses screamed in panic. Samuel dragged Abigail toward the porch, while snow and shouting swallowed the yard. Another rider charged Elias with a rifle butt. Elias caught the weapon mid-swing and snapped the wood apart with both hands before driving his fist into the man's jaw hard enough to send him crashing backward into the trough. Nobody in Black Hollow had ever seen violence like it before. Not rage, not madness, precision. The terrifying precision of a man who had survived too many winters, killing other dangerous men. Then Horace pulled a hidden pistol and grabbed Caleb. The little boy cried out as Horace dragged him against his chest, with the gun pressed beneath his chin. Everything stopped instantly. Snow drifted silently across the yard. Horace's nose bled heavily, one eye already swelling shut, but his grin returned. "Drop him," he hissed toward Elias, "or the boy dies." Elias stood breathing hard, blood running down his wounded arm. To the snow. His eyes locked onto Caleb, and suddenly Abigail realized something horrifying. The mountain man looked terrified, not for himself, for the child. Horace backed slowly toward his horse, while keeping the pistol pressed against Caleb's throat. "You should have stayed buried in those mountains," he snarled. Then he mounted the horse with Caleb trapped in front of him and rode hard toward the northern ridge. The riders followed in chaos behind him. Deputy Carter hesitated only a second before turning toward Elias. "I can still stop this," the deputy said nervously. "But if you go after him..." Elias picked up his revolver from the chopping block. "I know." Then he loaded the weapon calmly. Click, click, click. The sound echoed through the silent yard. Abigail grabbed his arm. Desperately. "You're bleeding." Elias barely looked down at the wound. He took the boy. "That storm's getting worse." Elias turned toward the mountains, already vanishing beneath white wind. For just 1 second, Abigail saw something beneath all the scars and silence. Fear. Not fear of dying, fear of failing again. She touched his face carefully. "Bring my son home." Elias stared at her hand against his scarred skin, like he had forgotten what kindness felt like. Then he nodded once and rode straight into the storm. By nightfall, the mountain vanished beneath white death. Snow came sideways across the cliffs so thick even the trees disappeared. But Elias kept riding. He followed broken tracks through frozen riverbeds and narrow passes, where one mistake meant falling hundreds of feet into darkness. Blood soaked his coat from the gunshot wound. Still, he pushed forward, because somewhere ahead, Caleb was frightened and cold, and 12 years earlier, another child had died waiting for him to come home. Near midnight, Elias finally found the cabin. An old trapper shack, half buried beneath snow, high along the northern ridge. Faint lantern light glowed through the cracks. Elias tied the mule below the ridge and climbed the final slope on foot, through waist-deep snow. Every step hurt, every breath burned. But when he heard Caleb crying faintly inside the cabin, the pain stopped mattering. Elias approached silently beside the wall. Inside, he heard Horace shouting, "You think anybody's coming for you? You think that animal actually cares?" Caleb's small voice answered through tears. "He said he'd come." Silence followed. Then Horace laughed bitterly. "That monster only knows how to kill." Elias closed his eyes briefly. Snow gathered in his beard. Then he kicked the cabin door open so hard, the hinges exploded inward. Horace spun instantly toward him with the pistol raised. Caleb screamed. The lantern crashed sideways during the movement, spilling oil across the floorboards. Flames erupted immediately. Orange fire climbed the walls fast as dry timber caught. Horace fired first. The bullet grazed Elias's ribs. Elias fired once in return. The shot tore through Horace's shoulder and slammed him backward across the burning floor. Caleb crawled desperately away from the flames. The fire spread violently now, swallowing curtains and beams while smoke filled the cabin. Horace coughed through blood and heat. "You ruined everything," he gasped. Elias walked slowly through the flames toward him. For a moment, it looked like 12 years of grief and rage might finally end in execution. Horace saw it too. Real fear finally entered his face. Then Caleb cried out again, as part of the roof collapsed nearby. Elias turned instantly. That choice saved Horace Bell's life. The mountain man grabbed Caleb and wrapped the boy inside his heavy coat, just as burning timber crashed behind them. Smoke swallowed the room. Flames roared upward across the ceiling. And suddenly, Elias Boone was back inside another burning cabin. Another winter, another child screaming. For one terrible second, the past and present became the same nightmare. But this time, he reached the child in time. Elias kicked through the collapsing doorway, carrying Caleb against his chest, while fire exploded behind them into the storm. The roof caved in seconds later. Horace Bell never came back out. By the time Elias reached Black Hollow again, dawn had begun breaking across the valley. The storm finally weakened behind him. Caleb slept wrapped tightly against his chest beneath layers of fur. Abigail saw them first. She ran barefoot through the snow before the mule even reached the yard. The moment Caleb woke and cried, "Ma!" She collapsed, holding him, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Samuel hugged both of them at once. Only then did Abigail look toward Elias. The mountain man remained seated silently on the mule. Blood covered half his coat. His skin looked pale beneath the scars. Deputy Carter stepped onto the porch, slowly holding several papers in shaking hands. "We found records in Bell's office," the deputy said carefully. "Signed statements, payment ledgers, witness reports." Elias said nothing. Deputy Carter swallowed. "Walter Bell ordered the cabin fire 12 years ago." Silence spread across the yard. "The 3 men Elias Boone killed," the deputy continued quietly. "They confessed before dying." Abigail stared. "So he was innocent." Deputy Carter looked toward Elias. "Number," he answered honestly, "but maybe justified." The valley buried Horace Bell 3 days later, beneath frozen ground overlooking the mines that had destroyed so many lives. No preacher cried for him. Spring arrived slowly after that. Snow melted from rooftops. The river thawed. Grass returned to the valley. For the first time in years, Abigail's farm began to breathe again. Neighbors who once stayed silent finally helped rebuild the burned storage barn. Deputy Carter erased the remaining debt claims connected to Horace's businesses. And somehow, without anyone ever discussing it directly, Elias Boone stayed. Stayed what? At first he still slept in the barn, then near the doorway, then eventually beside the fire whenever storms became too cold. No announcement, no conversation, just slow healing. One evening, near the end of winter, Abigail woke after midnight and found Elias sitting alone at the kitchen table. Moonlight spilled across the room. The mountain man held something carefully in his rough hands, a tiny wooden horse, old, worn smooth with age. "My daughter's," he said quietly before Abigail even asked. She sat beside him silently. Elias stared at the carving. "For years I kept thinking if I suffered enough," he whispered. "Maybe I deserved to keep breathing." Abigail gently covered his hand with hers. "You came back for my son." Elias lowered his eyes. "I couldn't save her." "Number," Abigail whispered softly. "But you saved him." The mountain man finally looked toward the small bedroom where Caleb and Samuel slept peacefully. The house stayed quiet for a long time. Warm quiet, not lonely quiet. Then Abigail stood slowly and placed another bowl on the kitchen table beside her own, same as she had the night he first arrived. Only this time, Elias did not try to sleep in the barn. And for the first time in 12 long winters, the man from the mountains finally stopped looking like someone waiting to die. Outside, wind rolled softly through Black Hollow beneath the coming spring. But inside the little farmhouse, light glowed warm against the windows. A widow, 2 boys, and a scarred mountain man who had finally found his way home. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.